Welcome to Somali Nexus, where we uncover the untold stories of the Horn of Africa. Stories of trade, exploration, innovation, and legacy. And in this very first episode, we ask a question that challenges the way we've long been taught to see history. Did Somali mariners reach Asia before Europe ever set sail in those waters? It's not just a question about ships or timelines, it's a question about recognition, about how history has too often left Africa's voice in the margins. But here at Somali Nexus, we're changing that. In today's episode, we journey back thousands of years to a time when the Somali coast was more than just a shoreline. It was a lifeline, a critical artery in one of the most complex and far-reaching trade networks the ancient world had ever seen. A place where Sewn-Plank ships called Baden, built with precision and passed down through generations, cut through the Indian Ocean, powered by knowledge of the stars, the winds, and the seas. These mariners weren't drifting along the edges of history. They were navigators of empire, reaching into Arabia, Egypt, and even across to Asia, long before the sails of Europe ever touched the horizon. Their ports thrived with markets, diplomacy, and culture. They moved goods, yes, gold, incense, ivory, spices, but they also moved ideas, technologies, and languages. They helped shape the very definition of what it meant to be connected in a pre-modern world. And the evidence? It's powerful. Archaeological findings, ancient texts, maritime records, all pointing to a truth that history hasn't given enough credit to. Somali sailors were global players in the ancient world, and their reach, quite literally, helped build the bridges between continents. So if you've ever wondered who really sailed the world first, who created the paths others would later follow, and how Africa's eastern coast helped spark the earliest waves of globalization, this episode is for you. This is just the beginning. This is Somali Nexus. Let's set sail. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're setting sail, you could say, towards the Horn of Africa, specifically ancient Somalia. We're digging into a really fascinating question that came up in the source material we've been looking at. Did ancient Somali mariners actually reach parts of Asia, way before European ships were common in those waters? We've got some incredible excerpts here exploring the really rich history and seafaring traditions of the Somali coast. Our mission basically is to pull out the key insights from these sources. We want to understand just how significant Somali seafaring was and, well, frankly, maybe challenge some older ideas about Africa's role in early global history.
Absolutely. And what's amazing is that these sources, they don't just give you facts. They tell this captivating story. It's about innovation, huge trade networks, deep cultural exchange, all based right there on the Horn of Africa. It really does make you, rethink the whole map of the ancient world.
Okay, so let's paint the picture. The sources give us the Somali coast. It's not shown as some, remote edge of the world. No, it's described as this absolutely vital crossroads, a connection point between the Red Sea and the massive Indian Ocean, a key artery in what was already thousands of years ago, a pretty complex global network.
That's exactly it. The sea wasn't a barrier, not at all. The sources are clear, is a bridge. And these ancient ports, they weren't just stops on a map. They were vibrant hubs drawing people from all over, facilitating trade, communication, and this two-way flow of culture for literally millennia.
The big question, the one our sources tackle head-on, is whether these Somali sailors were navigating to Asia before direct European influence really showed up. And the evidence, according to these texts, it points pretty decisively towards.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the crucial thing here. It fundamentally challenges those perspectives that tend to, sideline Africa. When we talk about early global interactions, these mariners, they weren't passive, they were active agents, skilled navigators, innovative boat builders, cultural brokers. They were key in shaping that early ocean trade long before others got there.
So how did they do it? What was the secret sauce according to the sources for this seafaring skill?
Well, the sources really emphasize this deep, long-standing seafaring culture. It's rooted in practical know-how and innovation. A really key part is their boat building, especially these unique ships called Baden boats. What's amazing, and the sources highlight this, is how they built them. The planks weren't not nailed, no, they were sewn together using natural fiber.
Sewn planks. Wow, that sounds incredibly strong, resilient, almost alive in a way.
Exactly. And the sources describe them just like that. Really resilient, perfect for the open ocean, and capable of carrying pretty big cargoes over very long distances. This wasn't just, hugging the coast. These were serious vessels for ambitious trips across the Indian Ocean.
Right, and sailing those huge distances takes more than just a good boat. You need some serious navigation skills.
Oh, absolutely. And the Somali navigators were, well, masters of the monsoon system. The sources stressed their deep understanding of these complex seasonal winds. They used that knowledge to time their trips, arrivals, and departures with incredible precision. They knew the stars, the currents, the coastlines intimately. The source even calls them intellectuals of their age, basically reading nature's signs like a map to make sure they got where they were going.
It's easy to focus just on the boats and the stars, but this seafaring must have shaped their whole society too, right? The sources mention that.
They do, yeah. And it's a really critical point. This big trade network, it wasn't just about goods changing hands. It brought significant wealth prosperity to the coastal towns. And that wealth helped fuel the growth of complex organized city-states. These weren't just villages. They had, sophisticated governance, busy international markets, important religious centers. They became these dynamic hubs in that huge maritime network, attracting traders from everywhere, fostering this really multicultural urban life.
So it wasn't only incense and ivory moving back and forth. They were swapping ideas, technologies, maybe even language and culture were influenced.
Precisely. They were conduits for people and ideas across huge distances. They even played a role, it seems, in spreading agriculture between continents. This whole maritime way of life just left a huge mark on their society.
Okay, let's get right to it then. The actual voyages and connections, specifically with Asia that the sources talk about, where do they start, time-wise?
Well, the earliest connections and the ones most documented in these sources are with the Arabian Peninsula and the Near East. Think ancient Egypt. The sources remind us about those Egyptian records going back millennia talking about the legendary land of Punt. Scholars pretty much agree that included parts of modern Somalia. Punt was described with real awe for its wealth and exotic goods.
And this wasn't just a brief contact.
Not at all. Far from it. The sources point to this continuous relationship starting as early as the 3rd millennium BCE. Yes, that's over 4,000 years ago. Somali ports were supplying crucial things like frankincense, vital for religious rituals, gold, ivory, exotic animals, all going to Egyptian temples and palaces. Just the scale of that sustained trade and the organization needed for it that, early on, it's kind of staggering.
4,000 years ago. Yeah, that time frame is hard to wrap your head around. What about South Arabia?
Equally important, according to the sources, archaeological finds mentioned in the texts, things like imported pottery, copper items, even traces of non-native crops found along the Somali coast, they show this deep integrated link between the Horn of Africa and South Arabian societies. These weren't just simple exchanges, they were broad, involving culture, farming techniques, technology, much more than just trade.
Now, the sources do say it's a bit harder to pin down definitive direct voyages further east, like to India, especially in those super early times.
That's true, yeah, particularly before, say, the 1st century BCE. But the indirect evidence the sources present is really compelling. The Indian Ocean trade system was definitely active. Finds of Indian pottery, other goods dating back to the early Iron Age discovered in East Africa. They strongly suggest that Somali mariners were very likely key middlemen in these early Indo-African routes. They were part of the network, absolutely integral, even if we can't point to as many specific logbooks for those earliest long-haul trips.
So they were plugged into that huge Indian Ocean web, making trade happen, even if the point-to-point trips aren't as clear as the Near East links early on.
Exactly. Active participants, enablers. The sources even mention goods from Southeast Asia, like cinnamon, making their way to the Mediterranean through African intermediaries, re-exported by Somali merchants. It paints this picture of them playing a pivotal role in these incredibly complex long-distance trade chains stretching potentially from the Far East all the way to Europe, long before European ships were doing those routes themselves.
And that implies more than just goods moving. That's a massive flow of knowledge. Navigation methods, maybe religious ideas, languages, tech.
Absolutely. It was a multi-layered exchange, really transformative way, beyond just buying and selling.
Okay, now here's where the timeline difference gets really stark. As the sources show it, Compared to these ancient ties with Asia and the Near East, Europe shows up, well, much, much later on the scene.
Oh, significantly later. I mean, European societies knew about valuable Somali exports much earlier. Sure, but they were getting them through layers of middlemen, like through Egyptian or Levantine traders back in the Mycenaean era. Direct contact, that was a whole different story.
So, when did that direct European contact really kick off, according to these sources?
The sources suggest it really began in earnest during the Hellenistic period. Specifically with the Ptolemaic dynasty ruling Egypt, they were actively trying to expand Red Sea trade. And importantly, the sources actually document some joint trade missions involving both Ptolemaic and Horn of Africa sailors.
And the most extensive direct engagement.
That really came with Roman rule, ports on the Somali coast, places like Apone Hafen and Malau. They're mentioned in texts like the Periplus of the Eritrean Sea. They became vital hubs linking the Roman world directly to Africa and Asia. Roman ships would bring in things like glassware, wine, tools, and trade them for those highly desired Somali exports.
Okay, let's just pause there because this is where the sources really kind of flip the usual timeline on its head.
It really is. I mean, look at the dates. Trade with Egypt and South Arabia. We're talking back to the 3rd millennium BCE, over 4,000 years ago. Their connections, maybe as intermediaries at first, but still connected with places like India, likely go back centuries before direct European contact.
And Europe's direct contact with the Somali coast itself.
According to the sources, that doesn't really start until around the 3rd century BCE. So you see these ancient Somali trade networks, especially the ones reaching deep into Asia, and the Near East. They weren't just established, they were thriving well before the Mediterranean world became direct players in that part of the Indian Ocean. Even the very earliest documented European involvement is centuries, maybe even millennia after Somali engagement with parts of Asia, was already fundamental to who they were and how their economy worked. That's the big point the source is making.
So it wasn't just that the Asian connections were older. The sources argue they were way more transformative for Somali society itself.
That's a critical point. Yes, they lasted longer, and they shaped Somali's social structures, their economy, their cultural identity, much more profoundly. You can see the depth of this exchange in shared technologies, maybe certain religious ideas, even language influences that shaped the Horn of Africa over these huge stretches of time.
These weren't just casual encounters, they were fundamental relationships built over millennia.
Exactly right. They basically built these trade arteries that allowed not just valuable goods, but entire cultures, new technologies, different ideas to flow constantly across the Indian Ocean and Red Sea.
Using those powerful monsoon winds, that was the engine driving this whole ancient system, wasn't it?
Precisely. It enabled predictable seasonal round-trip travel across huge stretches of open water, moving valuable stuff like frankincense, ivory, rare spices, exotic animals east and west, and in return getting luxury items, manufactured goods, even basic things like food and farming knowledge.
Which created those incredibly cosmopolitan mixed communities the sources talk about.
Yes, leading to that unique coastal culture that we see echoes of later. A culture that was African at its core, but also deeply cosmopolitan, enriched by traditions, languages, people from far-off lands across the sea. It even seems to have laid some of the groundwork for later cultural developments, like the Swahili cultures further south along the coast.
And then the knowledge transfer, boat building methods, metalworking, textiles, maybe even early astronomy and navigation techniques. Moving along these routes must have been enormous.
Absolutely huge. And don't forget the spread of religious ideas and art styles too. These sea lanes were highways for literally every kind of human exchange.
So pulling this all together, then what's the absolute core takeaway from these sources?
Well, the evidence laid out makes a really strong case that ancient Somali mariners weren't just capable of reaching Asia, but they actively established significant trade and cultural links there centuries, and, in some cases, millennia before Europeans directly engaged in that specific region.
They were major players, independent actors, in the very first phases of global trade. And just to recap those key details from the sources quickly, their location, absolutely strategic, the clever design of their Beden boats, sewn and resilient, their sophisticated mastery of the monsoons, and that incredibly long history of deep trade, Egypt back to the 3rd millennium BCE, South Arabia, and their key role linking towards India and Southeast Asia. all that was happening long before direct European ships started appearing around the 3rd century BCE.
And the really crucial point again is that these early Asian connections weren't just chronologically older. The sources argue pretty convincingly they were far more transformative for Somali society, fundamentally shaping their social structures, economy, culture, and creating that unique cosmopolitan identity right there on the coast.
So, recognizing this ancient legacy, which these sources do so well, directly pushes back against those older narratives, right? The ones that tend to minimize or just ignore Africa's role in early globalization and these big transcontinental exchanges.
It's a vital correction, really, the story of these ancient Somali mariners. It's a crucial piece of world history, often just overlooked. It clearly shows how the seas have always connected cultures and continents, always.
And reclaiming this history, the sources seem to suggest it's also inspiring today, isn't it? It speaks to those timeless human things: curiosity, courage, that drive to connect, the ability to navigate change, literally and figuratively.
They really were pioneers, pioneers of international trade, cultural diplomacy, maritime exploration. Their contributions are remarkable and deserve much wider recognition, much more celebration.
Which leaves us and you with a final thought to chew on after this deep dive. What other forgotten histories are out there? Histories of maritime powers, global connections, maybe from regions we don't usually focus on in the standard stories. And, how might uncovering their stories completely reshape how we understand just how deeply connected the world has always been?